In the shadowed halls of Tudor England, a dying boy king held the fate of a nation in his frail hands. His name was Edward VI, and his fervent Protestant faith was a fire that would soon consume his own family. His greatest fear was his Catholic sister, Mary, whose ascension would drown the kingdom in a tide of fire and blood. To prevent this, a new heir was needed, one who could be molded, controlled, and ultimately sacrificed. Enter Lady Jane Grey, a brilliant, pious, and tragically unsuspecting girl who loved her books more than any crown. Her world was one of harsh discipline and scholarly pursuit, ruled by parents who saw her not as a daughter, but as a key to unimaginable power. The physical and emotional abuse she endured was relentless, a brutal forging of a tool they intended to wield for their own advancement. They beat her for the slightest perceived infraction, their cruelty a constant reminder that her life was not her own. This loveless upbringing made her retreat further into her studies, finding solace in Greek and Latin, where she could not find it in her own family. The architect of this grand, treacherous design was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the most powerful man in England. He was a man whose ambition was a bottomless pit, a void that could only be filled with the acquisition of absolute control. He had risen through the court by sheer ruthlessness, a predator who saw every relationship as a transaction and every person as a step on the ladder. His eyes, cold and calculating, missed nothing, and he now saw the dying king as his ultimate opportunity to seize the throne through a proxy. Northumberland's plan was as simple as it was monstrous: marry his own son, the arrogant Guildford Dudley, to Lady Jane Grey. This union would bind the Greys to his cause and place his bloodline within a single heartbeat of the crown. The marriage was a cold, political transaction, devoid of any affection or choice for the two teenagers involved. Jane was horrified by the match, repulsed by Guildford's vanity, but her protests were silenced by her parents' brutal insistence. She was a lamb being led to a gilded altar for slaughter. As King Edward's life faded, his lungs turning to liquid fire, Northumberland pressed his advantage. He whispered poison into the boy king's ear, convincing him to write a new will, a document that would defy God and English law. This device for the succession was an act of supreme treason, disinheriting his own half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, in favor of the Protestant line of his cousin, Jane Grey. Edward, feverish and desperate to save his religious reforms, agreed, signing away the peace of his kingdom with a trembling hand. On July 6, 1553, the king was dead. For days, Northumberland kept the death a secret, a grotesque charade to consolidate his power before his enemies could react. The royal chambers were sealed, the scent of death masked by cloying incense, while couriers galloped across the country to secure key castles and ports. The air in London grew thick with unspoken fear and suspicion, as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. Jane was summoned to Sion House, completely unaware of the fate that awaited her. She arrived to find the great lords of the council assembled, their faces grim and unreadable. It was Northumberland who delivered the news, his voice resonating with false solemnity. He told her not only that her cousin the king was dead, but that he had named her, Jane, as his successor. The lords then knelt before her, one by one, their oaths of fealty echoing like hammer blows in the stunned silence. The world tilted on its axis for Jane. The shock of the announcement struck her with physical force, and she collapsed to the floor, weeping and trembling uncontrollably. She argued, she protested, she pleaded that the crown was not hers by right, that Mary and Elizabeth were the true heirs. She saw the trap for what it was, a poisoned chalice offered by a man she instinctively distrusted. But her cries were met with cold insistence, her parents and her husband chiding her for her weakness and foolishness. Eventually, broken down by their pressure and her own devout belief in divine providence, she relented. If this was God's will, she reasoned, who was she to defy it? She accepted the crown not with joy or ambition, but with a heavy heart and a prayer on her lips. This acceptance was her fatal mistake. The moment she stepped from the shadows of her library into the blinding, lethal glare of the English throne. It was a choice made under duress, a submission that would cost her everything. On July 10th, she was taken by royal barge down the River Thames to the Tower of London, the traditional residence of a monarch before their coronation. But as the grim fortress loomed into view, its stone walls seeming to sweat with the memory of past tragedies, it felt less like a palace and more like a tomb. The cheers from the sparse crowds along the banks were hollow and forced, a stark contrast to the genuine love the people held for Mary. Jane was their queen, but she was not their choice. Her mother, Frances, carried her train as she entered the tower, a cruel inversion of the natural order. Inside, Jane was presented with the crown jewels, their cold, heavy weight a physical burden that mirrored the spiritual one she now carried. The crown itself was too large, a symbol of how ill-fitting this new role was for her. She was a scholar forced into the role of a sovereign, a gentle soul trapped in a nest of vipers, and the isolation was immediate and absolute. The proclamation of Queen Jane was read out across London, but it was met with a chilling silence. The people murmured in the streets, their loyalty firmly with the daughter of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. They saw Jane for what she was, a puppet of the Dudleys, an usurper placed on the throne by a corrupt and hated council. Portraits of Mary were secretly passed from hand to hand, a silent rebellion that was gaining momentum with every passing hour. Meanwhile, in East Anglia, Mary Tudor refused to be erased. Upon hearing of her brother's death and Northumberland's treason, she acted with decisive speed. She was no fragile princess. She was her father's daughter, possessing an iron will and an unshakable belief in her own divine right to rule. She raised her standard, calling on the nobility and commoners to defend their true queen against the pretender in London. Her call did not go unanswered. Back in the Tower, Jane's brief reign was already fraught with conflict. Her husband, Guildford, and his domineering mother demanded he be made king. Jane, demonstrating a surprising core of steel, flatly refused. She would make him a duke, she offered, but the title of king was not hers to give. The resulting argument was furious and ugly, with Guildford and his mother storming away, leaving Jane to weep alone, betrayed by the very family that had forced this unwanted destiny upon her. As Mary's support swelled into an unstoppable tide, panic began to grip the council in London. The lords who had so eagerly knelt before Jane now began to whisper in shadowed corners, their loyalty shifting like sand. They saw Northumberland's gamble failing and began plotting their own escape from the sinking ship. The letters and reports arriving at the Tower became more and more desperate, each one a nail in the coffin of Queen Jane's 9-day reign. Northumberland, realizing he had to crush Mary's rebellion himself, made a fatal error. He marched out of London at the head of an army, but the soldiers were sullen and unwilling. As he rode through the streets, he noted the lack of cheers, remarking grimly, "The people press to see us, but not one saith, 'God speed us.'" He was leaving his power base, the Tower and the council, in the hands of men he had coerced, men who were now ready to betray him. The moment Northumberland was gone, the council acted. Led by the Earl of Arundel, they abandoned the Tower, gathered at Baynard's castle, and declared their allegiance to Queen Mary. They rode through the city, proclaiming Mary the true Queen of England to the wild, ecstatic cheers of the populace. Bells pealed, bonfires were lit, and the people celebrated the downfall of the Dudleys and the restoration of the rightful Tudor line. Jane's own father, the Duke of Suffolk, was the one to deliver the final, devastating blow. He found his daughter in her royal apartments and unceremoniously told her that her reign was over. He tore down the canopy of state above her head, the symbol of her sovereignty, and told her she could go home. The man who had forced her onto the throne was the first to abandon her to her fate, a final, cruel act of paternal betrayal. But she could not go home. The Tower of London, her palace for 9 days, now reverted to its true nature, a prison. Her guards were no longer her protectors but her jailers. Her servants were dismissed, replaced by stern-faced attendants who watched her every move. The dream, which had always been a nightmare, was over. Now, only the terrifying reality of her situation remained. She was no longer Queen Jane, but Jane Dudley, traitor. Queen Mary rode into London in triumph, her procession a stark contrast to Jane's somber arrival weeks earlier. The city erupted in celebration for their rightful queen, a woman they saw as a symbol of stability and tradition. Mary, hardened by years of persecution and uncertainty, now held the lives of her enemies in her hands. Her first act was to imprison the conspirators, including Jane, Guildford, and the now captured Duke of Northumberland. Northumberland's fall was as swift as his rise had been meteoric. He was tried for high treason, a charge he could not possibly deny. In a pathetic, desperate attempt to save his own life, the staunch Protestant leader publicly converted to Catholicism, hoping to win Mary's mercy. He renounced his faith on the scaffold, but his hypocrisy saved him nothing. The axe fell, and the architect of Jane's ruin met his own bloody end. In November, Jane and Guildford were taken from their cells to stand trial at the Guildhall. They were paraded through the hostile streets of London, where the crowds jeered and threw mud at them. The trial itself was a mere formality, its outcome predetermined. They were accused of high treason for usurping the crown, a charge to which Jane calmly pleaded guilty, accepting the legal consequences of actions she had been forced to take. The verdict was delivered without hesitation. Guilty. The sentence was death. Jane was to be burned alive on Tower Hill or beheaded as the Queen pleases. She received the sentence with a quiet dignity that unnerved the court. She had expected nothing less. Returned to her cell, she now lived under the constant shadow of the executioner's axe, each dawn a potential prelude to her last day on earth. Queen Mary, however, was initially reluctant to execute her own cousin. She knew Jane was a pawn, a victim of the ambitions of others. For a time, it seemed that Jane might be spared. She was held in the gentleman jailer's quarters, allowed her books, and treated with a degree of respect. But she was a Protestant symbol, a living alternative to the Catholic Queen, and this made her existence a perpetual threat to the stability of the throne. The final nail in Jane's coffin was an event she had nothing to do with: Wyatt's rebellion. Mary's announcement of her betrothal to Prince Philip of Spain, a Catholic foreigner, ignited widespread outrage among the English Protestants. They feared England would become a mere satellite of the powerful Spanish Empire. Sir Thomas Wyatt raised an army in Kent, marching on London to depose Mary, and he claimed to prevent the Spanish match. Crucially, and with breathtaking foolishness, Jane's own father, the Duke of Suffolk, joined the rebellion. He had been pardoned by Mary for his role in the Somers coup, an act of remarkable clemency. He repaid this mercy by once again committing treason, hoping to place his daughter back on the throne. This act of betrayal directly implicated Jane in the new uprising, whether she was involved or not. It proved to Mary's council that as long as Jane lived, she would be a figurehead for Protestant dissent. Wyatt's rebellion was ultimately crushed at the gates of London, its leaders rounded up and destined for the gallows. But the damage was done. The Spanish ambassador and Mary's own nervous counselors insisted that a permanent example must be made. The threat had to be extinguished completely. They argued that Mary's mercy had been mistaken for weakness, and that she could never be safe while Jane Grey drew breath. The political calculus was simple and brutal. Jane had to die. On February 7, 1554, a heartbroken and resolute Queen Mary signed the death warrant. The order was given for the execution of Guildford Dudley and his wife. Her hand did not tremble as she sealed her cousin's fate. It was an act of state, a brutal necessity to secure her crown and her Catholic restoration. The time for mercy was over. The time for blood had come. The warrant was dispatched to the Tower, a scroll of parchment that was as deadly as any blade. John Feckenham, Mary's own chaplain and the Dean of St. Paul's, was sent to Jane's cell with a grim task: to save her soul by converting her to Catholicism. He arrived to inform her that she was to die in 3 days, but that the Queen, in her mercy, would grant a reprieve if Jane would renounce her heresy. Feckenham, a kindly man, genuinely believed he was offering her salvation, both in this world and the next. He expected a frightened, pliable girl. He found instead a theological scholar with an unshakable faith. For the next few days, he and Jane engaged in a profound and eloquent debate over the nature of the Eucharist and justification by faith. Jane, armed with scripture and a powerful intellect, calmly and systematically dismantled his every argument. She was not afraid of death, she told him, for she trusted in her salvation through Christ alone, not in the rituals of a church she considered corrupt. Feckenham was so impressed by her piety and intellect that he managed to secure a 3-day postponement of her execution, hoping more time would allow him to succeed. But Jane was resolute. She gently told him that he was troubling himself in vain. "I am ready to receive death," she stated, "for I am assured that I shall, for losing of a mortal life, win an immortal life." She spent her final hours not in fear, but in prayer and writing letters of farewell. She wrote a final, heartbreaking letter to her younger sister, Catherine, in the pages of a Greek New Testament. She urged her to live a life of faith and to rejoice in Christ, as I do. It was not a letter of sorrow, but one of spiritual triumph. She also wrote a message to her treacherous father, forgiving him for his role in her death. "Though I must needs say that if I might have amended the matter, I would not," she wrote, a subtle indictment of his fatal ambition. On the eve of her execution, Guildford, imprisoned in a separate tower, begged for one last meeting with his wife. He wanted to say a final goodbye, to seek comfort in her presence. Jane, with a strength that belied her years, refused him. She sent back a message that such a meeting would only increase their misery and pain, and that they should instead meet shortly in a better place. She would not allow earthly sentiment to distract her from her spiritual preparation for death. The morning of February 12, 1554, dawned cold and grey. A fine, drizzling rain fell over the Tower of London, chilling the bones of the spectators who had gathered to watch the grim spectacle. Jane was originally scheduled to be executed on Tower Hill in public, but Queen Mary had granted a final, small mercy. She would be beheaded in private, within the walls of the tower on Tower Green, away from the jeering mob. This was a privilege usually reserved for royalty. From her window, Jane witnessed a sight of unimaginable horror. She watched as her husband, Guildford Dudley, was led out of his prison and across the courtyard towards Tower Hill for his public execution. He was young, handsome, and terrified, a boy of perhaps 19 going to his death. He looked up at her window, hoping for a final wave, a last sign of affection. Jane watched, her heart breaking, until he was out of sight. A short time later, she heard the rumble of a cart. She looked out again to see it returning from Tower Hill. In the back of the cart, thrown carelessly onto a bed of straw, was the headless, blood-soaked body of her husband. His beautiful head, with its flowing hair, had been wrapped in a cloth and placed beside his mangled corpse. Seeing this, Jane reportedly cried out, "Oh, Guildford, Guildford, the bitterness of death is past." Her own ordeal was now only moments away. It was her turn. Sir John Bridges, the lieutenant of the Tower, came for her. She emerged from her lodgings, dressed in a simple black gown, clutching a prayer book in her hands. She was pale but composed, her face a mask of serene resignation. John Feckenham walked with her, still making a last, desperate attempt to win her soul for Rome. She walked with a steady pace, her eyes fixed forward, not on the grim destination, but on the eternal one she was so certain awaited her. She mounted the few steps onto the scaffold, which was covered in fresh straw. Waiting for her was the executioner, a hulking figure leaning on a fearsome, gleaming axe. He was a professional, brought in from the public execution site at Tower Hill. Jane looked at the small crowd of officials and trusted Tower residents who had been permitted to watch, her eyes scanning their faces without fear. She was not a cowering victim, but a queen meeting her end with a courage that shamed her tormentors. She turned to the crowd and delivered a short, clear-voiced speech. She did not proclaim her innocence of the crime against the Queen, as she had accepted the crown, and that was treason in law. "I do wash my hands in innocence of the fact," she declared, "before God and all of you." She confessed her faith, stating that she looked to be saved by no other means, but only by the mercy of God in the blood of his only Son, Jesus Christ. It was her final, defiant Protestant sermon. After her speech, she knelt and recited Psalm 51 in a clear, unwavering voice, a plea for divine mercy. When she finished, she stood and handed her gloves and handkerchief to one of her weeping ladies-in-waiting. The executioner then stepped forward and asked for her forgiveness, as was the custom. "I pray you dispatch me quickly," she told him, granting his request. She then began to untie the ribbons of her gown to expose her neck for the blade. The executioner offered her a blindfold. She took the cloth and tied it around her eyes, plunging her world into absolute darkness. This final act of preparation, however, disoriented her completely. Suddenly blind and vulnerable, her composure finally cracked. She took a step, expecting to find the block at her feet, but found only empty space. A wave of pure animal panic washed over her as she realized she was lost on the scaffold. Her voice, now filled with the terror of a lost child, rang out across the silent courtyard. "What shall I do?" she cried, her hands flailing in the darkness. "Where is it? Where is it?" She stumbled forward, a blindfolded girl searching desperately for the instrument of her own death. It was a moment of supreme, unbearable pathos, the scholar and queen reduced to a frightened, helpless teenager in her final seconds. It was an onlooker, possibly the lieutenant of the tower himself, who finally broke the spell of horror. He stepped forward, took her trembling hand, and gently guided her to her knees before the block. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit," Jane whispered, a final prayer as she laid her head down on the rough-hewn wood. The feel of the cold, solid block against her neck was the last sensation she would ever know. The executioner wasted no more time. He raised the heavy axe high above his head, its polished steel catching the grey morning light for a fraction of a second. With a single, expert swing, he brought the blade down. The sound was a sickening, wet thud that echoed across the green. The 9-day queen, the 16-year-old girl who had been sacrificed for the ambitions of others, was dead. Her body was unceremoniously bundled away, her head held up briefly by the executioner as proof of the deed. She was not given a royal burial. Instead, her remains were taken to the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the final resting place for many of the tower's most famous prisoners. There, she was buried in an unmarked grave, laid to rest alongside two other beheaded queens of England, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, another victim of the brutal Tudor court. Lady Jane Grey's story is not one of a powerful monarch, but of a brilliant young woman whose life was stolen from her. She was a pawn in a game she never wanted to play, a sacrifice on the altar of political and religious ambition. Her intelligence, her faith, and her incredible courage in the face of an unjust death have transformed her from a minor historical footnote into a symbol of innocence betrayed. Her tragic end serves as a chilling reminder of the human cost of the relentless pursuit of power. The legacy of her execution was profound, hardening the lines between Protestant and Catholic factions in England. For Protestants, she became an instant martyr, a pure and learned symbol of their faith, murdered by a vengeful Catholic queen. Books and pamphlets celebrating her piety and steadfastness were printed in secret, fanning the flames of religious resistance against Mary's reign. Her death was not the end of the conflict, but a bloody new beginning that would lead to the Marian persecutions. Queen Mary's reign, which began with the execution of her cousin, will be forever stained by blood. Her attempts to force England back to Catholicism led to the burning of hundreds of Protestants at the stake, earning her the infamous moniker, Bloody Mary. The rebellion that sealed Jane's fate was a precursor to the deep-seated hatred many of her subjects would feel for her and her Spanish husband. In the end, her ruthlessness failed to secure a Catholic dynasty, leaving the throne to her Protestant sister, Elizabeth. Jane's father, the Duke of Suffolk, was captured shortly after the rebellion failed. He was found hiding in a hollow tree on his estate, a pathetic end for a man of such high ambition. He was tried for treason a second time, and this time there would be no pardon. He was beheaded on Tower Hill just 11 days after his own daughter. His greed and foolishness had not only destroyed his child, but had ultimately led to his own ignominious death. The story of Lady Jane Grey's final, panicked moments on the scaffold, her blind search for the block, became a powerful and enduring part of English folklore. It highlighted the profound cruelty of her fate, transforming her from a political statistic into a tragic human figure. This detail, more than any other, ensured she would not be forgotten. It was a moment of pure, raw terror that exposed the horrific reality behind the cold machinations of the state. Over the centuries, Jane's image evolved from that of a Protestant martyr to a romantic heroine, the subject of countless paintings, plays, and books. Artists depicted her as a beautiful, innocent victim, often emphasizing her youth and piety against the backdrop of a dark and cruel world. This romanticization, while not always historically precise, cemented her place in the popular imagination as the quintessential tragic queen, a story of virtue destroyed by vice. In 1876, a dramatic, large-scale painting by the French artist Paul de la Roche, The Execution of Lady Jane Grey, became an international sensation. It depicted her blindfolded in a white satin dress, feeling for the block in a dark, straw-filled room, a scene of intense emotional drama. Though historically inaccurate in its details, the painting's power cemented the enduring image of Jane's final moments, a masterpiece of historical tragedy that continues to captivate and horrify audiences to this day. The Tower of London itself remains indelibly marked by her story. The Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, her burial place, is a site of somber pilgrimage. Visitors stand on the site of the former scaffold on Tower Green, a simple memorial marking the spot where she and other famous prisoners met their end. Her ghost is said to be one of the many that haunt the fortress, a lonely, white figure seen wandering near the site of her death, forever trapped in the memory of her final, terrifying day. The tragedy of Lady Jane Grey is a stark lesson in the brutal nature of power. She was born into the highest echelons of the nobility, but this proximity to the throne was not a blessing, but a curse. Her life was never her own. It was a political asset to be leveraged, traded, and ultimately discarded by her family and the ruling elite. She was a casualty of a dynastic and religious struggle far older and more vicious than herself. Her story forces us to look beyond the grand sweep of history, beyond the dates and the battles, to the individual human lives destroyed in the quest for a crown. She was not just a name in a succession crisis. She was a 16-year-old girl with a brilliant mind and a deep faith, who wanted nothing more than to be left alone with her books. Her death serves as an eternal indictment of a system that could demand the life of a child to secure a political end. The execution of Lady Jane Grey ultimately did not bring peace or stability. It was merely one bloody chapter in the turbulent story of the Tudor succession. The religious violence she was sacrificed to prevent only intensified under Mary's rule, and the political scheming continued unabated. Her death was a brutal, tragic, and ultimately futile act in a relentless game of thrones, where the lives of the players were as disposable as the pawns on a chessboard.